And it is 2 p.m. CST, guys, and welcome aboard the Philosophy Chat. And my guest today, again, is going to be good old John. He's going to be joining us today, going over normative ethics and moral particularism.
Hello,
Um,
hello.
so, did you want to say anything real quick, John, or should I just kind of hop into the subject?
No, yeah, I'm down to get started.
Okay. So yeah, we're gonna go over more Kantianism today. We're gonna go over some of the types of issues that we went over yesterday. However, before we got into the subject of moral particularism, we gotta mispronounce this, even though I've said it
Hmm.
1,000 times. I wanted to ask John just a few questions about some of his opinions on meta ethics before we go on to normative ethics. And that was one of the types of questions in terms of hypothetical norms and then skepticism towards categorical imperatives. And the question went something like um, we can't just have instrumental and hypothetical norms because they have to be grounded in something other than hypothetical and instrumental norms. And they're going to be, in a way, grounded according to us in terms of a categorical norm. And one of the types of skeptical objections that might be made is that this type of categorical norm is just actually not a categorical norm, but it just appears to be a categorical norm. So it's a sort of fiction that acts as such, as one, but it's actually not. And John believes he has just a fairly intuitive and easy objection to this. Um, and this objection, which is going to be a tangent, about maybe a 10-minute detour on our conversation before we get started, is an objection that's going to be related to Barry Strout's criticism of transcendental deductions. And for those of you guys who don't know what a transcendental deduction is in Kant, transcendental deduction is just basically trying to find out what are the conditions of possibility of any sort of X. So if we have an experience such that is it is of a certain type of species of X, there must be something that necessitates or gives the ability for the possibility of such an X. So if you don't mind replying to what you think Shroud's objection is and what you think the sort of appearance of a categorical imperative as being something that's illusory, but you don't think that that works.
Right. So Stroud, of course, is replying not to a question in metaethics, but a question in epistemology and our knowledge of the external world. But within that context, his concern with transcendental deductions is that even if you find or argue for, however well, something being the condition of the possibility of knowledge, of experience, maybe more specifically of knowledge of the external world, or in the case of metaethics, perhaps knowledge of what we should do and what's right and wrong, then that kind of argument doesn't actually alleviate the skeptical worries because the skeptic is precisely concerned about us not having. I mean, it depends on the kind of skeptic. So, like, say a skeptic about the existence of objects in an external world, that kind of skeptic is doesn't think that we have such knowledge, and to say that something is necessary for such knowledge, that something is a condition of the possibility of such knowledge, is not to alleviate the worries that that skeptic has. And Stroud, I think quite rightly, points out that Kant's arguments, so Kant's transcendental deductions, only identify conditions of the possibility of experience and conditions of the possibility of knowledge, and indeed conditions of the possibility of knowledge of the external world. But his uh, he argues against Kant on this front that this doesn't get us anywhere, or it doesn't answer the skeptic. And so I think that Stroud at the end of the day is quite right about that. Um, as far as Kant goes, and I know that I don't want to make this all about skepticism about the external world, because that is specifically what Stroud's argument is directed towards. So I should perhaps, to relate this to the meta-ethical skepticism that you're concerned about, or that you were talking about the other day, this would look like the way this problem would arise would be one of even if you say that categorical norms are a condition of the possibility of having norms in general or of hypothetical norms, and not just that categorical norms are conditions for even having hypothetical norms, but more specifically, perhaps that some specific categorical norm is a condition for having any hypothetical norms whatsoever. Maybe following the norm of acting only in a way that everybody could act. Let's say that's your categorical norm. That even if you were to identify that particular norm as a condition of the possibility of having any hypothetical norms whatsoever, of anything being normative for you at all, even in a hypothetical way, even in a conditional way, I mean, then that would do nothing against someone who is skeptical of norms or normativity or value in general. Because even if something is necessary for norms, someone who's skeptical of norms isn't going to care. There's not the fact that something is necessary for norms doesn't show that the thing which is necessary for norms, which here we're talking about categorical norms or a specific one like the one I mentioned, that even if that's necessary for norms, someone skeptical of norms will see nothing of interest there. And so this is exactly analogous to how someone who's skeptical of the external world, of the existence of objects in space and so on, is not going to care at all, or is not going to be moved, I should say, by an argument that the categories or transcendental idealism or whatever it is, whatever metaphysical system you identify, or whatever conditions of knowledge you identify, are conditions for the possibility of knowledge of the external world. Or if they're a skeptic about all knowledge whatsoever, then to say that knowledge is impossible unless the external world exists is not going to move the skeptic, because the skeptic is precisely a skeptic of knowledge in general. And so you have so Barry Stroud's argument, which is of course not an argument in metaethics, has this what seems to be a similar application to metaethics in the way that I just described, in that the skeptic will not be moved by an argument that something, whatever it is a necessary condition for some second thing, given that they're skeptical of the second thing as well. It just becomes it points to the pointlessness, as it were, of these kinds of transcendental deductions. Now, with that laid out, the part of the answer that, or part of my response to Barry Stroud's argument is that indeed that's not at all what Kant's goal is. So Kant isn't seeking to argue against somebody who is skeptical, let's say, of all norms whatsoever, or someone who is skeptical of all knowledge whatsoever. That this isn't the kind of skeptic that Kant is particularly worried about. Kant thinks we have other ways of responding to that kind of skeptic, other indeed more personal, sort of everyday ways of responding to that kind of skeptic. What Kant is interested in responding to in these different works that are at issue in talk of transcendental deductions. So, for example, when it comes to the skeptic of the external world, Kant is only interested in responding to the skeptic, and only tries to respond to the skeptic of the external world who isn't skeptical of the internal world. So who isn't skeptical of our knowledge of our own thoughts, our knowledge of what we believe, our knowledge of what our intentions are, our knowledge of the fact that I currently see colors all around me. Like, so even if what I'm seeing around me isn't an external world, let's say someone's skeptical of what I see around me being an external world, the skeptic that Kant is replying to is someone who, despite being skeptical of that external world, isn't skeptical of the fact that currently seems to be an external world. And so it's only that kind of skeptic that Kant provides an argument against, and he does so precisely by showing that the knowledge of the internal world, as it were, the knowledge of what you believe, what you think, what seems to be the case to you, what you seem to perceive, that knowledge is dependent on the existence of an external world. And that's the kind of argument that Kant provides in that context. In the moral context, Kant likewise is not interested in, and has nothing to say to someone who's skeptical of all normativity in general, someone who's skeptical of all norms, someone who is skeptical even of claims like you should do what you want, for example. Kant is replying to someone who accepts that there are hypothetical and instrumental norms, someone who accepts that if you want to have good oral health, then you should brush your teeth, for example. So, but someone who accepts that, Kant has then an argument to say that that norm, that same norm which that skeptic accepts, where is dependent on further norms, namely categorical norms. And Kant's arguments for that proceed precisely by showing that categorical norms, or indeed some specific categorical norms, like the norm of acting only in such a way that everybody could act that way, that norm is a condition of the possibility of all these other hypothetical norms. And it's only that kind of skeptic that Kant is interested in arguing against. And so Barry Stroud's arguments, for example, don't actually get a grip on the position that Kant is adopting, precisely because they are that feature of Kant's arguments is one which Kant already accepts. But of course, perhaps that isn't satisfying to someone who's worried about these other kinds of skeptics, and that's certainly the case. But that's of course not what transcendental deductions are trying to show.
And your other objection against this, or maybe the same objection, just kind of formulated in a different way, is that the necessity of certain types of hypothetical norms, or that rely on categorical norms. How do I word this? We worded this in the PM not too long ago. Just in virtue of them needing something, just in virtue of them needing a certain type of categorical norm is sufficient to say that it's not just an appearance, right? That it's actually a substantive norm that is categorical if it functions as the condition of possibility for these other norms.
Exactly.
Right. So there can't necessarily be a purported form of skepticism against this.
No, since in order for a norm to be categorical, it has to be necessary for any norms whatsoever. If you have successfully argued that a norm is a condition of the possibility of any norms whatsoever, so including hypothetical norms, then you have, by that very fact, argued that that norm is a categorical norm.
Okay. That's just what I wanted to sort of lay out for a few audience members. But thank you, John.
No problem.
So that, like I said, that's going to just be a small detour on it. Looks like someone's asking a question. Is this John an error theorist on Twitter?
Oh, no.
No, I don't think so.
I am neither on Twitter nor an error theorist.
Yeah, he's a moral particularist and believes in some form of deontology, as far as I know.
Well, actually, we'll get into that, yeah, in the discussion today.
Okay, sure. So, so let's then move on to, I guess, normative ethics and moral particularism. Where did you want to sort of start?
I was thinking it might be good to start with a sort of lay of the land within normative ethics, because the stuff I want to say about moral particularism is in many ways contrasts with the sort of more general picture of normative ethics that is.
Yeah, I understand that you have a few criticisms against others, like forms of normative ethics, like utilitarianism and consequentialism. You gave me a few, well, not knockdown arguments, but some fairly good concerns by a philosopher a while back ago. I don't know if that's something that you wanted to get into. I can't remember the name of the philosopher anymore that you gave me that had like 3 or 4 objections against consequentialism and utilitarianism, or it might have just been consequentialism.
Yeah, Judith Jarvis Thompson's arguments against consequentialism in general.
Right.
Here, let me actually grab that book just in case. Words for when we get to that.
Let me see if I can find them.
Yeah, her book Normativity.
Because I remember those being fairly good objections to these ideas.
Yeah, we can go over those objections to consequentialism.
Oh no, this was was this Judas Thompson? Okay, yeah, yeah. J.J. Thompson's criticisms, yes, of
Yeah.
consequentialism. Yeah, okay, so it is indeed those, yeah. And you had three groups of objections. Do you want me to put down those three groups of objections? Actually, you could go ahead and tell me if you want to do that, and I'll pull them up. I have them written down right here. I'll repost them for you since you basically posted these earlier in PM.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah, but
So,
you don't have to get into those right now. It's you could start with fresher grounds.
yeah, I would. No, I think that seems like a good place to start. I was thinking of giving a bit of a lay of the land of normative ethics in general to start us off. But if we want to get, I'm happy to get right into consequentialism right now.
No, it's up to you, man. But you can give the lay of the land real quick.
Okay, yeah, I was because I was thinking in particular of specifying how the kind of normative ethical theory that I think is right, which is a kind of moral particularism, contrasts not only with consequentialism, and certainly does, but also with a deontological normative ethical theory.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to sort of get a bit of a lay of the land here, there's if on the view, I should say, that right and wrong is determined by general rules. So on the view that there are certain rules about what is right and wrong, there's generally speaking these two sorts of positions that one might adopt. One is this more sort of intuitive picture, which is present perhaps most obviously in something like the Ten Commandments, is this sort of deontological picture where there just is a set of rules of do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this if you can. Some of them might be hypothetical, and so on. And this picture in which there's some specific set of rules. You might imagine. Actually, I was putting that quite generally, so maybe I'll put this a bit more specifically. So, say a theory in which the way to do what you should do is keep your promises, uh, don't hurt other people, uh, don't lie, respect your family, or respect those who respect you. You might imagine like a golden rule sort of principle of do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And this kind of deontological picture,
Mm-hmm.
or rather, this kind of picture is precisely what is often referred to as deontology. So it's a sort of you have this specific set of duties, and what you have to do is do what your duty is. You have to follow these rules, basically. Still within the view that what we should do is based on rules, there's a further view, which is consequentialism, which has the idea that there's just one rule that you have to follow, and that rule is maximize the good. Make there be as much good in the world as you possibly can. And this, uh, so of course, this consequentialist picture contrasts with the deontological one precisely because the rule that it identifies is uh, it covers basically it has an answer for all possible actions that you might uh, perform, right? While the deontological picture just gives you a few rules that will show up and be relevant in a whole bunch of different cases. Like when you make a promise, of course, then the rule keep your promises will then be relevant to that. Or if
Right.
you're interacting with your parents, if the rule is respect your parents, then that rule will be relevant in that context. But
So
then the consequentialist one goes much further and says that for every action that you're going to take the action that produces the best consequences.
right. But in a sense, both of them are subsuming particulars under some sort of universal thesis that we ought to follow.
Exactly. Yeah, they both think that general rules are the form that morality takes, that they're the form that what is right and wrong takes, that it's captured by general rules, these universal principles.
Right.
So that's those are certainly two positions, and these are sort of the standard ones that are often discussed. And certainly before the 70s were the two most commonly discussed positions in normative ethics. And then somewhere around the last 50 years, you get the introduction of virtue ethics. And how virtue ethics interacts with these two is a little bit of a complicated picture, but certainly insofar as a new position within normative ethics was introduced through these discussions in the 70s and then the 80s and then up to today, um, what comes out of this is this picture that what's right and wrong is not captured by any general rules. It's captured by what the virtuous person identifies as right and wrong, and that what figuring out what's right and wrong becomes not a question of figuring out how to apply general rules. It becomes a question of becoming virtuous and developing the kind of sensitivity to the context of action, the kind of sensitivity to the circumstances in which you do something, which enables you to see what's right and wrong in those circumstances, and that in different circumstances you will, if you have developed this sensitivity to right and wrong, you will come to different judgments. But in each circumstance that you come to those judgments, you've only come to the right judgment insofar as you have a good character, insofar as you have developed a character, or rather, I put that a bit less vaguely. You've developed a sensitivity to right and wrong and to what is relevant to right and wrong in the circumstances in which you're acting.
And so this is going to be pretty close to an Aristotelian view, if I'm not mistaken at this point, right?
Yeah, exactly. This would be yeah, the Aristotle is sort of the forefather of this kind of view, that what you have to do is develop good character, and once you develop good character, you will see what is the right thing to do in a given context.
So do you have any sort of distinctions between your view and sort of a classic Aristotelian view of where one begins to create sort of virtues for themselves, certain types of dispositional virtues? Hold on, I'll be right back.
I guess I'll just wait till Marty's back.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Oh yeah, no worries. So you were saying, how would I distinguish what this kind of view from, or at least the view that I take, from an Aristotelianism
Right,
or
right.
an Aristotelian virtue ethics? Yeah, I mean that would take getting into the specifics of Aristotle's view. Um, I mean, as far as what you described, certainly I accept something like that. Character just is a kind of disposition, a very complex disposition. It's how we are disposed to act in different situations. It's a disposition which comes with a uh, it's both a disposition to judge something, and to see something a certain way, to conceive of your action under a certain description, and to see certain features of a situation as relevant. So you're walking down the street and you see someone. Part of having a good, let's say, charitable character, say a generous character, would be when you walk down the street and you see someone uh, suffering in poverty, you feel, not only do you feel bad, but you feel drawn to helping them in some way, right? That would be one of the kinds of dispositions that would be involved in having a good character, or in maybe more specifically having a generous character. Um, and so certainly to that extent, I agree with Aristotle, and similarly to the extent that what it is to have a good character, or even what it is to have a specific virtue, like a virtue of generosity, like a virtue of magnanimity, like a virtue of courage or temperance, and so on. That what it is to have any one of those virtues is dependent on having all of the other virtues. So that, for example, a being courageous means not acting uh, cruelly, for example. So it's not courageous to, uh, have people. So like let's say you're in a situation in which you're being criticized for having uh, I don't know, spat in someone's food because you got angry and you spat in their food to get back at them, and people around you start yelling at you, and they're telling you off. And let's say that you we might be tempted to say courageously push through this, and you're not scared. You have no fear at the slings and arrows, as it were, that are directed towards you on the basis of your action. uh, that temptation to call that courageous is, on an Aristotelian view, and indeed on my view as well, uh, a mistake, because insofar as the action is cruel or disrespectful, or however whatever other features of that particular action, of pushing through and ignoring all of these insults and threats and so on that are directed your way, insofar as that behavior also is vicious in these other ways, as cruel or disrespectful and so on, it's also thereby not courageous. That just having a strong disposition to resist fear and to persist in your actions against fear is not on its own enough to be courageous. It has to be to resist fear, in the right ways, under the right circumstances, and for the right reasons, and that all of those things factor in these other virtues
Mm-hmm.
that go beyond courage. So that part as well, I also um, agree with. The place where I would then part ways with Aristotle is that what it is to be virtuous on the whole or in general depends uh, most fundamentally on what it is to be a human being. So what our nature is as a certain kind of animal, a certain kind of creature that has certain capacities, certain basic natural capacities that come prior to the development of character, and that these capacities and in general the nature of that kind of creature, a human being, is what determines what is virtuous for us, for us specific human beings. And that's the stage at which I part ways with Aristotle, since I take a more Kantian approach to virtue ethics, where the what it is that determines what is virtuous for us is our nature, not just as human beings, although that's of course relevant too, much as other features of our situation and what we are, as it were, are relevant to what we should do. But that at the most fundamental level, what determines what is virtuous for us, what kind of character we should have, is our nature as rational creatures, our nature as creatures that act for reasons, um, as something which is a more general feature of ourselves than just being a human being.
So one might say that one acts in accordance to reasons that are based upon their nature or their human nature. What would be wrong with this type of picture? Or are you just kind of qualifying it in an additional sense?
It is to some extent just a qualification, because I do think that our nature as human beings then adds further content to what we should do, right? There are certain things that are going to be true of us, true of us in the sense of things that we should do
Mm-hmm.
and ways that we should be, that are going to be uniquely true of us as human beings, precisely because of our nature as human beings. Perhaps the most obvious case of this would be, because we are social creatures, we have certain social needs, and these social needs then introduce further constraints on what would be virtuous for us. So, for example, developing good social skills, being able to read other people, understand what other people are saying, being able to uh, speak in a way which is clear and understandable to other people. These are then further things which I think are virtues, but they're virtues only because of our nature as social creatures, our nature as human beings. But these would be posterior to, or would come after uh, more fundamental virtues that we would have and a more fundamental basis too for the virtues, which come from our nature as rational creatures. And maybe to put that a little bit in a bit more of a thick way, and not quite as thin a way as rational. I mean, that's such a widely abused term, I think, in general.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say more specifically our nature as self-conscious creatures, creatures that are aware of our own thoughts and aware of our own intentions. We're aware of the intentions on which we act and are able to evaluate those intentions uh, prior to acting or even in the process of acting. And it's our nature as that kind of creature, which I think is the basis for these more fundamental virtues.
Yeah, I've always kind of struggled myself to try to find a demarcation point between human nature and, say, human reason, or, kind of reason with a capital R. I guess one might start talking about certain biological forms of essential traits when they're talking about human nature, but that doesn't seem to be the case necessarily when people are talking about where values might arise due to human nature, right? They seem to, in this sense, be very, really close with talking about reason as well, and or certain types of criterions that rationality would ensue. And generally, the types of epistemic norms that we undergo due to just the type of reasoning that we have, what might be sort of to just endorse certain types of norms like modus ponens or modus tollens or consistency or continuity, right? These seem to be like features of rationality, or like a very thin theory of rationality that I would sort of, a lot of people would subscribe to. But of course, someone like Kant has a little bit more of a thicker theory of rationality too, to not just include
Mm-hmm.
theoretical reason, but also practical reason. And the
Mm-hmm.
certain types of maxioms that you gave us earlier, like the categorical imperative, is acting in accordance with a certain type of universal principle, such that if I was to act in this way, I have to act as if everyone was to do it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that certain type of maxiom seems to be also a part of rationality, except in a sort of more broad way, and a sort of, I guess, inner constitutive necessity, one that we sort of kind of talked about in the beginning, for why we need reasons to believe in this sort of categorical norm in the first place, right? That we can't just sort of end on hypothetical or instrumental norms.
Yeah, exactly. The kind of rationality that Kant and Kantians have in mind is not, yeah, just being logical or some silly thing like, or some very thin thing like that.
But
Yeah,
those
it really
do,
goes further.
yeah,
Huh?
but those do exist though, right? I mean, you need at least some. I mean, like the idea of escaping thin theories of rationality like that, to use a phrase from John Elster, seems
Mhm.
sort of absurd.
No,
Um,
indeed, they're going to be integrated in some way into a thicker theory of rationality.
right. Do you think that these thicker theories of rationality, I don't want to deviate too far, are accepted in virtue of there being some sort of absurd conclusion that without them we couldn't, that without them we would just lead to some sort of reductio ad absurdum? Or are there auxiliary reasons for why we'd have to accept like a thicker form of rationality, um, one that might say that, okay, we need to harmonize, say, our rights, to go into maybe Kant's political theory, in such a way that it harmonizes with other people's interests. My interests harmonize in a sort of legitimate way with other people's interests. How do we move from the thin theory of rationality to a thicker theory of rationality? Is the movement just of logical necessity, or is it something further than that? You think that pushes the motivation? I mean,
It's certainly something beyond logical necessity. It's certainly something more than just avoiding logical contradictions or logical absurdities. or anything of that sort. It's what Kant would regard as a synthetic truth, or the truth of a synthetic proposition as opposed to the truth of an analytic proposition. Um, but the more specific, I should say, uh, move there, or this more specific source of these conditions of rationality on a Kantian view, is what it takes for us to be able to do the things that we in fact are doing. So when it comes to put that in a bit less of a general way, we in fact are able to reflect on why we do what we do. We in fact have a self-consciousness. We in fact are conscious of ourselves as doing certain things and thinking certain things and believing certain things and so on. And that very act, or each of those acts of self-consciousness, each of these acts of self-awareness and of recognition of the reasons why we do things, where reasons is kind of not meant in a normative sense, but actually just in an explanatory sense, of in the way that I punch someone in the face because for the reason of getting back at them, for example. Um, and because we do that, because we have that capacity to reflect on why we do things, further things are required of us that uh, we would be unable to do that kind of self-reflection successfully. We'd be unable to succeed at that kind of self-reflection if we did not bind ourselves or govern ourselves according to certain principles. Or to put this in a more virtue ethical phrasing, because that suggests some kind of deontology, if we were not a certain kind of person, if we did not develop our character in a certain way, such that we see certain things as reasons, if we didn't change ourselves to have that kind of sensitivity to recognize some things rather than other things as reasons. So say to recognize the plight of another person as a reason, for example, we would be unable to successfully engage in that process of self-reflection, which we do in fact engage in. And it's the fact that we are self-reflective creatures in that way, what Kant in the Critique of Practical Reason calls the fact of reason, is precisely the starting point for identifying the actual norms that we then are bound to. These things like act only in such a way that all people can act that way, or any rights have to be harmonized with any rights for one person have to be harmonized with the rights of all other people. Those kinds of principles.
Right. I mean, do you want to get into how one might begin doing such a project like that, or did you want to go on to something, um, some other topics before we go there?
Um,
Because one
yeah,
of the
certainly
yeah,
that'll certainly be to get into quite a lot of technical details, but
I mean, one of the things that we could go over before we do that is, and we've already touched on this subject, but since we're doing a new stream, we might have some new people, is just
mhm.
resolving the disparity between particularism and universalism. Because generally, when people think of ethical principles, they think that we should subsume particular examples under certain sets of universal maxioms that we ought to operate under. And you don't think that there is you don't think that there is a disparity between a type of universalism synthesized with a type of particularism. So if you can kind of guide us through that.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose there's two ways in which I think particularism, this idea that when you act, you should like what is right and wrong to do, is context dependent. It depends on the circumstances in a way that cannot be reduced to just placing the particular situation under general rules. But that kind of particularism is compatible with an appeal to universal principles in sort of these two ways, both of which I think apply to the universal principles that Kant often talks about. One of these ways is it's compatible with the appeal to formal principles, principles that don't actually have any content except as the form under which something else, in this case, intentions or maxims, uh, except to the extent that some intention or maxim has that form. So something like the categorical imperative, or and in its different formulations. So especially the formulation of act only in such a way that all other people can act that way. It's a merely formal constraint on what our intentions or maxims uh, should be. It only specifies that it doesn't specify what our maxims should be in the way that, say, utilitarianism specifies what our maxims should be. Right? Utilitarianism will specify that your maxim should be, or your intentions should be the ones that uh, you know you should intend to produce the best consequences, say, or your intentions should be the ones that in fact produce the best consequences, one or the other of those two. The principle on its own directly specifies what your intentions should be. Whereas something like this formal principle, it doesn't in any given context specify what your intentions should be. It can only do so once you, no, sorry, I should put that a bit of a different way. Um, you have to form an intention. So you have to have an intention in a certain context. And then the specific features of that intention, the particular features of that intention, uh, either are able to uh, fall on either. Sorry, I need to back up a little bit. The particular intention that you form either has the requisite form, and either is an intention that everyone could have,
Mm-hmm.
or it's not an intention that everyone could have. And that could be taken in a deontological way. And a lot of Kantians, up until the 90s at least, did read, Kant as adopting a kind of deontology where you just have this universal rule, this general rule of, the same one that I've been saying, act only in such a way that everyone could do this, and then you just apply that rule to a particular situation. Whereas on this different way of looking at it, it's the particular context in which you're acting involves treating certain things around you as relevant considerations in your actions. So, for example, when I decide to, let's think of like a very big action, like I decide to, uh, you know, go into a PhD in philosophy, for example, or we might imagine someone deciding to become a doctor. Let's take that as an example. When someone decides to become a doctor, the way in which for that intention to become a doctor, to go to medical school, let's say, to make it a bit more specific. When someone forms that intention to go to medical school and goes on to then fill out their applications and so on as part of fulfilling that intention, the way that you check if everybody could do that, if that's something that satisfies the categorical imperative, would, on a deontological view, involve just taking that intention, right, which has the content that is specified. I intend to become a doctor or to go to medical school, and then just seeing, like, quite literally, could everyone do that? And of course, you get an absurd conclusion when looked at that way. And that itself is, if everyone became a doctor, then no one would be producing food, and so then, of course, it would be impossible for you to become a doctor because you would lack the necessary means to even become a doctor. And so it seems like the categorical imperative would say nobody should go to medical school or nobody should become a doctor. What the absurdity in that deontological reading of the categorical imperative can be avoided by taking a particularist reading of the categorical imperative, where certain features of the person's situation are treated by the person as relevant to their choice. So, for example, when someone's deciding to go to medical school, they're not directly thinking about the fact that other people out there in the world are, providing the necessary means for other people to survive, that are producing food and
Right. They
infrastructure and so on.
they take it for granted that them becoming a doctor is going to be sustained by some sort of uh, pre-established harmony of some sort.
Exactly. Yeah, they take for granted that there are these background conditions and that these background conditions are fulfilled. And for a lot of us, or rather, for I should say, perhaps not for a lot of us, but what the a distinction you could make between two different people is one person who is sensitive to the obtaining of those background conditions, so is actually recognizing whether or not there is a need for them to do something else. Like, let's say they live in a society in which there were too many doctors, and it would just, it would actually be, um, if uh, no, sorry, I should have put this. Yeah, they live if they were insensitive to these background conditions, to this condition of there being a need for doctors, or there being room for doctors, even more so than that. So that might be one person who is, let's say, is sensitive to that obtaining the background conditions, and then another person, let's say, isn't sensitive to whether or not those background conditions obtain. For the person who isn't sensitive to whether or not those background conditions obtain, their maxim of becoming a doctor doesn't include those background conditions because they lack that sensitivity. They lack that. They're not prepared or disposed to change what they intend to do on the basis of whether or not those conditions obtain. And so for them, when the categorical imperative is applied to their intention, it does get universalized. Their intention does get universalized, or is treated as being universalized in that absurd way that it is for the deontological reading, right? It is their intention is, because it's not sensitive to those particular features of the context, namely the whether or not there's enough people to produce food and infrastructure and so on. Uh, there The categorical imperative test, this universalizing test,
Right.
treats their intention as wrong
Right. I
because
see. I
they
see
lack
what
that
you're saying.
sensitivity.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You're basically saying that there's going to in order to perform an ethical theory, in order to make in order to have a good ethical theory, one has to keep into consideration sort of historical, cultural, all sorts of contexts that are relative towards the universal judgment that universal action that you're going to the action that you're going to make if
Mm.
you're choosing to relativize it, right? So those universal actions that you're going to have to take are going to have to also at the same time, in conjunction with it, take into context. Um, Presumably the doctor example that you gave there is a pretty good context, right? So if you're universalizing the function, um, then you already have a sort of background assumption that there are going to be other people who are obviously not going to be doctors that are going to sustain that possibility. But are you even making a universal judgment at that point? Um, because you're because if you're taking into the context, if you're taking in the context that there's other people that aren't doctors that are going to sustain you being a doctor, you're not universalizing the function. Are you really universalizing the function of you becoming a doctor?
Yeah, so this is where the second kind of universal principle comes into the picture, and it indeed is. So when I say the second kind, I mean a different kind of universalizing than this idea of having a universal form, which was the earlier one that I had introduced and led into this discussion of context. The further kind of universalization that I think is at work in a particularist understanding of the categorical imperative is the idea of universalizing across people, so that, which basically becomes a matter of, to put it quite simply, a matter of not making an exception for yourself, not being a hypocrite, not having an intention that treats yourself as in a unique situation, as in a situation which is simply unique and not unique because of any particular feature of the situation. Um, and so not acting on that kind of hypocrisy or that making of an exception for yourself. And this kind of universalizing is still at work even once you bring in these features of the context to which the ancient is sensitive. Even once you bring in something like, whether or not the background conditions obtain for being able to sustain the pursuit of becoming a doctor, right? Whether it's enough farmers and so on. Even once you build that in, that of course makes the assessment of your intention uh, context sensitive, and so you can't universalize it to say all other cases of people intending to become a doctor, because indeed you've specifically added in these background conditions that the agent's sensitive to, but it's still nonetheless universalizing across people, across uh, perspectives, you might say, insofar as it's not dependent on your intention is not dependent on treating yourself as an exception.
So
You
so
admit that everybody in this context could do this, but it's still everybody in this context,
so just
basically.
I guess for clarity's sake, because I'm still not completely picking it up. The distinction is between people and what?
It's universalizing across people and universalizing across contexts. So the latter kind of universalizing is excluded by particularism, right? You, insofar as you take a particular stance, you are limiting the applicability of the principle that you're acting on
So
only to situations with the relevant features, only to the relevant contexts, in other
so
words.
when we're making a universal can't even say it, a universal statement about context, are we trying to find a universal statement such that there's some sort of harmony between these sets of people? I'm not I don't know exactly how to phrase this, John.
Oh, no, I see. Yeah, that's a more basic question about how it is that you even apply the categorical imperative, regardless of whether you apply it in a context sensitive way or not in a context sensitive way. Certainly, it's not a matter of people's intentions harmonizing. Uh, it's a more direct matter of, well, there's two different ways in which you apply the categorical imperative test. You um, either the intention, once universalized, like once you ask the question, what if everybody did this, as it were, uh, it becomes the case that the intention can't even be acted on. This is what Kant calls a practical contradiction. The intention destroys itself when universalized, when uh, it destroys itself uh, in the world in which everybody acts that way. Even on this particular reading, if it's just a world where everybody acts that way in this particular context. Um, so that'd be one way in which you would run into, or in which an intention or a maxim would be rejected by the categorical imperative test. Another way would be simply that when asking this question, what if everybody did that? And as we're talking about a particularist reading of that, uh, what if everybody did that when they're, not only when, what if everybody did that in this context, in the relevant context? Um, then you would you would not intend for you would recoil, as it were, from that scenario. You can't, you find yourself unable to simultaneously continue to intend uh, no, it's not about simultaneity. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Uh, you just find that you would not intend for that to be the case. You would not intend for it to be the case that everybody would act on your intention when they are in the relevant context. And that would be another way in which the intention would be found to be in conflict with itself, or to be uh, where the intention would be assessed as wrong. So one of those two ways would be how the categorical imperative test would have to be applied. Um, but and that test still it still can get off the ground, or it still is usable, and that way in which the test is used still applies, even once you switch to this particularist reading where you talk specifically about what if everybody did that when they're in the relevant context.
So I'm still trying to think this through my head.
Mm-hmm.
When would one know when to apply a universal judgment with respect to context as opposed to with respect to people? What's the sort of methodology behind when one applies one as opposed to the other? I mean, I guess intuitively you would know. Maybe you just intuitively know when to apply one or the other, but I think that there's probably something more to it than that.
Yeah, and actually, this talk of applying the categorical imperative test, although this is, of course, something that we might do in a particular when we're acting. I might be going to the store and about to buy some meat, and I ask, well, what if everybody bought meat in this in the you know
Right.
in the context in which I'm buying meat? I might do that. I might actually explicitly apply the categorical imperative test, and I've been talking in that way to make it uh, the to make these otherwise very technical points much more stark, much more easily understood. But the idea here is that what it is for an intention to be wrong isn't dependent on the agent, the person acting on that intention, actually applying the categorical imperative test. It's just a matter of every time you form an intention, either it is universalizable in this way or it isn't. If it is not universalizable in this way, then your action is wrong. You're acting on that intention is wrong. And the what that looks like in this particularist reading is that the universalizing of that intention includes or is limited to the features of the context that your adoption of that intention, you're arriving at that intention, whether you arrive at that intention by explicit deliberation or whether you just, you hear the doorbell ring and you just go out to answer the door, right? You don't deliberate about whether to answer the door. You hear it, and then the fact that the doorbell ringing is uh, something that you see as calling for you as a reason for you to go and answer it, right? So like when you have that intention, those features of the situation that your intention, the forming of that intention is sensitive to, in the doorbell case, it's sensitive to the fact that the doorbell rung. Those are the features of the situation that form the limiting context for universalizing your intention. It's those features of the situation that your forming of the intention is in fact sensitive to, like the doorbell ringing,
Mm-hmm.
that provides the context within which you universalize the intention that you form. In that case, the intention to answer the door. So the intention to answer the door is not an intention. It's not when you universalize that. It's not like what if everybody is just always answering the door? That would be absurd. What if every time there was a door, someone answered it or opened the door? It's limited to that specific context, and other features might be relevant too. Are you currently working? Okay, well, that might be, if you're in the middle of working and you intend not to answer the door, because even though the doorbell's ringing, that's one relevant feature of the context that you're sensitive to. But you're also sensitive to the fact that you're in the middle of working on something, and then you might try to see if that can be universalized. And then you could imagine even further particularizing of the intention, but that particularizing, what features get factored into the context, depends on what features of the situation you in fact are sensitive to when you form the intention. Does that get at some of what you were
Well, I mean,
wondering
it's.
about?
I mean, I certainly see the absurdity of saying that everyone can't answer the doorbell, and of course, there's a second absurdity if I answer the doorbell, say when I'm working from home and it's COVID hour or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I get to work from home. Then it's sort of not within my obligation to stop working either. If I was to universalize that, then no one would work. And of course, that's an equal absurdity. So we're faced with these two aporetic situations of where I have to universalize both of these actions, and of course, I can't possibly
Mhm.
do that. So there has to be something more to it, right? There has to be a certain type of sensitivity towards the context that's given. Um, but if I appeal to this sort of context that's given here, I'm I seem to strictly be jettisoning the idea of that original universality, and one might say that's sort of done in an ad hoc fashion. Um, what prevents a person just from using any sort of context sensitivity, any sort of context sensitive situation, and just saying, well, I'm not going to apply any sort of universal standard because of this context or something like that?
Is I'm trying to think actually what the nature of that question is. Are you asking what if someone doesn't want to engage in, ask themselves whether or not their action can be universalized? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the way that I saw it, maybe I'm misunderstanding you, is that context exclusive situations are supposed to inhibit the earlier universalizing, unless they don't. Unless you're just saying they should give us, unless you're saying they should just restructure the way that we're universalizing certain types of actions.
Yeah, my thinking here is that, and the general idea here in Kantian particularism is that the features of the context, as you're saying, restructure how you universalize insofar as they specify what situations you are universalizing across,
If
so
they're
that you're not, for example, just universalizing across every time there's a door, you
okay,
answer
I
it.
see. Okay,
It's
so so
it's when the relevant other features obtain.
okay, so if I understand it, then the formal feature is going to retain its integrity. That is, the universability of our action is going to retain its integrity. Um, but strictly formal principles are empty, right? They're not just saying that I'm going to universalize this action doesn't have any sort of content to it.
That's right.
So the determination how I'm going to attach content to my formal principle of universalizing a certain type of action is going to be context sensitive. It's actually going to rely upon, to use Kantian jargon, sensible intuitions. And
Yeah.
so, to use again the old sort of Kantian motto, intuitions without concepts are empty, um, concepts without intuitions are blind. We would again apply this sort of to ethical norms and ethical actions being such that I can't obviously make any sort of actions or even know what I need to do unless I had certain types of sensible intuitions, in which that makes that formal principle not just vacuous. And it's only when I have when I have a certain type of content can I make certain types of universal formal actions. Um, and when I do, then I can make that action. And of course, it pays to have a certain type of sensitivity, as you're saying. Is that my is, am I if am I sorry? Am I understanding you correctly here?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And indeed, that line that you quoted, intuitions without concepts are blind, and concepts without intuitions are empty, is exactly, there's a version of that for this talk of uh, formal principles, the categorical imperative,
Mm-hmm.
and the specific intentions, the particular intentions that feed into that formal principle that are universalized, or that are either universalizable or are not universalizable.
I see.
Because we might think in the case of, in this action case, as opposed to in the perception case, which is at issue in the
But there is.
the
Sorry, go ahead.
oh yeah, I was just going to sort of build on the analogy that you drew. um, in the action case, you might say that desires or wants without uh, universal intentions are, or we might say without the kind of self-reflection that's involved in universalizing,
Mm-hmm.
those desires are blind. But this kind of self-reflection where you ask yourself, what if everybody did that? Or can this action be universalized? Am I just making an exception for myself? That kind of thing. That kind of self-reflection without desires, without actually the person actually wanting specific things or being inclined towards specific actions, that principle is empty. And so indeed you get the analogy that you drew is, I think, quite strong and is directly applicable to in part why a particularist reading of the categorical imperative is so compelling and indeed not ad hoc insofar as uh, the it there is certainly a dependence of the categorical imperative test of this universalizing move on having particular intentions to actually apply it to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I get what's going on now. Sure, that makes some sense because this is something sort of what I did with Grant the other day. I don't know if you saw that stream of where we went with Freud and Kant, and we were trying to draw a sort of story, a sort of synthesis between both thinkers, and a sort of story of moral development, of where we get these types of maxioms, such as universalizing our actions. Where do we get that type of where do we recognize that sort of necessity?
Interesting.
And it doesn't seem as though we recognize that maxiom or that sort of necessity from any particular contingent state of affairs, say from a priest or a mother or a father. It's right. It's rather that is learnt. That necessity is learnt through experience, but not any particular form of experience, right? Because that's sort of how Kantian philosophy works. It's independent of experience, not without experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that recognition is learned from some sort of particular scenario. But I'm wondering if, but it doesn't, but with learning the maxiom, at least the categorical imperative, I'm wondering if that is if that's particular. Like if there needs to be a sort of particular state of affairs of where you can learn that maxiom itself. There doesn't seem to be that doesn't seem to hinge on any sort of particular sense content itself, like the beginning sort of universal features of how we even make moral judgments, right? Those seem to be just sort of necessities that we see within any sort of particular context, and we seem to somehow acquire that form of knowledge. Do you get what I'm getting at right here?
I think so, and I think there's something to that for sure. For any person learning what they should do and learning, and so indeed we might say for Kant having arrived at the categorical imperative test or having arrived at these uh, these principles of these formal principles of how people should act, that had to have come through some particular historically situated process of, you know, his own development, or indeed for us, when we learn things are right and wrong, we have something specific in our experiences teaches us that. We only come to learn that something is wrong through the particular experiences that we have.
Yeah, but
And so there's
that seems to presuppose a necessary formal principle without having a formal principle in the first place, which is very odd because that's almost as if we somehow because that seems to be independent of any of the sort of context dependent
yeah
scenario where we need to already have a formal principle synthesized with some sort of content of which we know how to apply the universal standard. This is actually developing a sense of the universal standard to begin with. I hope we're not losing the audience right here with with this. Maybe we should have gone over the three maxioms that Kant holds. I can't remember them off the top of my head. I know you probably might be able to though.
yeah I've been sort of just using one of them because it's the sort of easiest one
Yeah,
to explain. But um, I want to go back though and continue with the point you were just making, and I'm also interested in answering one of the questions that just popped up in chat.
sure. Yeah, we can go over that.
But just to finish the thought that I was in the middle of, um, the concern that you raised, I think, is or the point that you raised, I should say, is well taken. Indeed, what I was leading up to in what I was saying there and talking about the historically situated experiences and how we come to learn about moral principles and about, indeed these specific moral principles, the categorical imperative, like the three different formulations of the categorical imperative, are although any one person is going to need those experiences to come to learn what's right and wrong, the purported universality of these principles as formal principles comes from them being constitutive of intentional agency, that they are just part of the structure of intentional agency, part of the form of intentional agency. And it's only because that's what they are. And indeed, I might qualify everything that I'm saying with if that's what they are. But certainly, if that's what they are, then they don't come from the particular experiences that a person goes through in learning about them. They come from the nature of the activity itself, the nature of intentional action itself. And it's that which makes them universal, is that they universally apply to any creature which is acting intentionally, or any creature at least that is acting intentionally and is capable of self-reflection. So this wouldn't apply to other creatures acting intentionally. And that's the source of their universal necessity.
Okay, so let's move on, I guess, to the question that was just posed. How would you respond to the objection that virtue ethics is circular? If ethics is supposed to tell us how to act, then being virtuous is not an answer, unless we already know what makes an action virtuous, in which case we would need a priori principles to define what virtues are.
Prior moral principles. Yeah, so I think that's a good objection, and it shows the dependence of a first order ethical theory of virtue ethics on some kind of meta ethical theory. It shows that any kind of virtue ethics is going to be groundless or circular if what it is to be a virtue is not specified by some further conditions on what it is to be a virtue. And yeah, I think put the response that way. Maybe more specifically, because the virtue theorist is going to say that you figure out, like, any given person, figures out what to do and figures out what's right and wrong by developing a good character, and then once they have a good character, or to the extent that they have a good character, you might say, because none of us have completely and utterly perfect characters. To the extent that they have a good character, they will see what they should do and what they should not do. That this is a feature of something that they will be able to see once they have that. And indeed, they may constantly question, like, do I actually have a good character? And that kind of self-reflection is no doubt a further feature of a further kind of virtue, right? That kind of critical stance towards what you believe, what you think you should do, and so on, is no doubt a further virtue. But it's still going to be identifying what is the right thing to do is going to depend on having that sensitivity. How would you know what it is to have a good character in the first place? Well, that's precisely where a meta-ethical theory would have to come into the picture. Is that there would have to be a specification of what it is to be good, and having an account of what it is to be good would then be what fixes what it is to have a good character. It would fix what the virtues are and what it is to be virtuous. And any particular person would only be able to identify what a good character is. So the epistemic question of, like, how do I know what is a good character to have, would have to come from knowledge of what it is to be good, knowledge of what is good, and knowledge of what good character is. And where that knowledge is not just some knowledge of a bunch, it's not being able to list the things that are good, or say what specific things are good or what general rules are good. It's a meta-ethical knowledge. It's an awareness of the nature of goodness as opposed to the general things that, or even the particular things that are good.
So do we want to move on to
Um,
the objections against consequentialism?
oh yes, yeah. This has been enough sort of making claims about about what I take to be a, a good theory, and let's move on to some arguments against other theories, because indeed nothing that I've said here should be taken as as strongly supporting particularism. It's just sort of explaining what the view is.
Let me let's see if I can actually.
Oh yeah, are they gonna fit?
Yeah, that's the yeah, that's the thing that I'm gonna see if I can make fit. Um, let's see if this is gonna work here in just a second, since we're about to give some.
Maybe while you're doing that, I can give a better picture of the context in which these objections
Yeah,
are relevant, because these in many ways, and I think this will hopefully stand out to some people as they read these objections. They're not really objections; they're actually more just like questions. And the actual way in which they provide objections is in the context of, as one often hears when from people defending consequentialism, of someone saying that consequentialism is the correct normative ethical theory because it's so obvious, right? That when you have often the argument, and you see this especially in less academic circles, so you see this from a lot of pop philosophers, like Sam Harris is probably a good example of this, to the extent that he's a good example of anything. But you'll often see this sort of simple argument for consequentialism, which just takes the form of, you should do what has the best consequences because obviously you should do that. And what these questions do is they call that obviousness into question by showing that this doesn't really get you anywhere. If even if it seems obvious that of course you should just do what has the best consequences, that doesn't provide any basis for action at all. And so it's precisely because there are these further questions. Okay, so when it comes to, so let's take the first group of questions. Of course, when I say group of questions, when I gave these to you, I had listed them as a group of questions because they're not just one particular question; they are a whole bunch of questions that you might ask. So if let's say the consequentialist says something like, uh, you know, when you should do what has the best consequences, what I mean is you should do what produces the most happiness or what produces the most pleasure or whatever. They'll give some, let's say they give some further specific account. Then you can start one form of question you can ask, about that is, okay, well, uh, does the value of that thing, the fact that the thing that you identified as good, does the fact, if let's say it's pleasure, right? Does the value of pleasure uh, depend on anything else, or is it just that pleasure itself is valuable? So if it seems intuitively obvious that pleasure is valuable, right? If that's part of, because of course at each of these different stages, uh, these questions are meant to be asked to someone who is treating each move that they make, each further thing they add into their consequentialist theory as something that obviously is true, right? Oh, consequentialism is obvious. Obviously, you should do what has the best consequences. Obviously, what good consequences are the consequence of people being happy or people enjoying themselves or having pleasure. And so there's always this move of this is just obvious. And so this first group of questions asks, so is the pleasure in someone's misfortunes worth the same as the pleasure someone gets from donating to charity? Is basically, is all pleasure equal in value? Um, and these kinds of objections are, these are simple intuition pumps in a sense, but they are only meant to undermine the obviousness of that further step to pleasure or happiness or whatever as the thing of value. And so it's a sort of general class of questions that one might ask when talking to someone who sees their consequentialist theory or their utilitarian theory or what have you as just obviously true. So does the role of that first set of questions make sense to
Yeah, yeah,
you?
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, I've already went through these, so these are all, I think, intuitive enough to me to have a set of objections.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess I'll maybe then lay out the other two just so that we're all, I guess everyone in the audience is on the same page as well. So yeah, the second one, um, well, no, while the first group of questions identify features of the uh, kind of pleasure or happiness, etc., that is being proposed as obviously good, as obviously of value. The second group asks questions about whether the causes of that pleasure or happiness or whatever, um, whether that is relevant to the value of pleasure or happiness, etc. So if is it the case that like when someone often not realizing that something is going wrong, like um, I have no idea that my friends hate me, right? And let's say everyone that I think that I'm close with just hates me, and I have no idea. And let's say that I'm happy when I reflect on how much my friends love me, and I am only happy when I reflect on how much my friends love me because I'm completely ignorant of how much
Right,
they hate me. Is
right.
Does that pleasure have the same value as the pleasure of someone else who thinks that their friends love him and is in fact right about that they're not ignorant of what the thing that's giving them pleasure is not just something they believe out of ignorance. And so
Right.
that for that further set of questions can be asked, and you can imagine this in other ways too. That's a classic. You think of uh, Martha Nussbaum's work on, and John, you mentioned John Elster earlier. He does a lot of good work on this topic as well, on adaptive preferences, right? So, there's certain things that we like, which we only like because we have come to accept that we're not going to get the things that we liked before changing our preferences. So, the classic case in John Elster's book, Sour Grapes, is the fox that wants the grapes on
Right.
the high up on the wall, and because he can't get to the grapes, just adapts his preferences and then thinks to himself, and indeed comes to really believe, like, oh, actually, no, I don't want the grapes. I actually just want to eat this grass that's in front of me because I can reach it. But of course this is completely non-trivial. Classic cases of adaptive preferences are young girls in Afghanistan who come to not want to get education because they are incapable of getting education, and because the people around them tell them that they shouldn't want to get education, and they change their preferences they adapt their preferences to these circumstances, to the the pressure that they receive either from people telling them what to think and what to want, or just from what's possible for them to want. And the question, this kind of question applies to that as well. This group of questions includes that questions about this. Are adaptive preferences as worth satisfying as non-adaptive preferences? And so there's a whole range of questions, and we might say objections to consequentialism, which can take this form.
I definitely hear you.
Like,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry. No, I mean, I don't think I can contribute anything further on that. It's just it's gonna sort of be blind agreement at this point. Well,
right.
not. I mean, the principles are kind of like showed up there, but I mean, it's an interesting way that you're formulating them nonetheless. So
Yeah, I find it helps to recognize these general features of objections, because different forms of consequentialism or even utilitarianism are often very different. There are huge differences in different kinds of utilitarianism. and consequentialism, and it helps to see that the general form in which these objections can take, so that an objection can be adapted, as it were, to the specific form that someone's utilitarianism takes. So if someone's asking in the chat, so adaptive preferences means your beliefs are influenced by your environment. It's a version of that. Yeah, an adaptive preference is a preference that you form when you reject an earlier preference because of your environment, because you realize that you can't do something, or because the people around you tell you that you can't do something or shouldn't do something. Um, so they're basically cases of suppressing what you want, or cases of
Like the fox that wants the grapes, or are you basically saying suppression in the form of certain types of societal expectations that might suppress one's base urges, like in the sense that Freud talks about it with the superego and the ego?
yeah, those both, I would say both of those would be cases of adaptive preferences. But I was also thinking more specifically of cases where the person with the preferences suppresses what, which I guess is more Freudian, I suppose, but not necessarily that that's the society around them suppresses what they want, suppresses their preferences, but where they themselves suppress what they want because there is something, either because they can't get what they want, or because people tell them they shouldn't get what they want, and so on. Change or addition. No, it can also be the formation of new preferences. So um, if you are, a good example of this would be, again, let's say young girls in America or in Canada, or I mean, a lot of different Western countries are constantly have their beauty affirmed as something of value. And so a lot of people growing up in a lot of young girls growing up in a society in which beauty, a woman's beauty in particular, is treated as the main source of a woman's worth, will come to develop the preference to be beautiful and to have people love them for how beautiful they are. And that would be another example of an adaptive preference, a preference that is of an added adaptive preference, one that is formed adaptively in the sense that it's taken to be something that a preference that you have to have in order to continue to live. Basically, it's something to continue to uh, enjoy the life that you're enjoying, um, but it's one that is added as opposed to suppressed. Okay, yeah, no problem.
So, did we go over group three already? By the way, I can't remember now.
No, yeah, we haven't quite gotten to that one, and that's one. Yeah, so that's one that is much more sensitive to this context of a consequentialist saying that their view is just obvious, that, oh, of course it's just obvious that you should do it, has the best consequences, precisely because these kinds of questions in this third group reveal the way in which there's actually nothing that's been said when in appealing to uh, the production of the best consequences.
Right.
Uh,
I think Kursgaard in Self Constitution mentions something like this in the beginning. We reviewed it not too long ago. Is that there's multiple ways of seeking out the good or preferences or desires, basically, and that they're not always going to be accumulative. They're going to be generally in contrast with one another. Um, so
yeah, exactly.
do we view them as an average, or is there going to be some sort of other? Are there going to be other tools to sort of measure the way that we go about selecting for the best possible good? Because it doesn't seem, I mean, we might have certain types of values or desires that we think that are good. Say going to church or going to the gym, or I don't know, going to the park or whatever. But often we can't do all of these at once because they're going to obviously be in some sort of contradiction with one another in terms of what we can do as individuals, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have to select one or the other, but how do we begin to sort of weigh these? We can't just. It doesn't seem like we could just sort of arbitrarily weigh these in terms of like value points or something like that, right?
Mhm.
Um, so there's going to be sort of a question of how we should go about doing A or B, or how we should basically be distributing whether we should be doing this good as opposed to that good in a certain type of time.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. And indeed, it's precisely worries of that sort which do often lead consequentialists to become specifically utilitarians, since there is precisely those tensions of how do you weigh one thing that's good and against another thing which is good, uh,
Well, yeah,
if
but
they
then
are
we get
two
into
different kinds
the
of good.
yeah, then we get into the problem of how to measure utils. Like basically, well, I mean, like
Yeah,
utility points instead of consequential points, and I just think that that begins to get into other sort of absurdities.
right. Yeah, the actual measuring of pleasure is or happiness or whatever is, of course, yeah. That's I might add that in as a fourth group of objections. Um, but even if you had a perfect way of measuring utils, pleasure, or whatever, then you would run into this issue of, okay, well, fine, pleasure is the common measure of good. Let's say that all these different things that balance against one another when I'm making a choice are have as a common measure of value just how much pleasure they produce or how pleasant they are or something like that. And the further group of questions digs even deeper by then asking the question, okay, but is the action that has the best consequences the one that just produces the largest sum, as you said, accumulation of utils of pleasure? Is it the one that has the largest average? Is it the one that has the, is it doesn't maximize the minimum? As in Rawls's difference principle. There's just all these questions of how it is that this common measure, pleasure or whatever, gets distributed, whether it's distributed across people, across time, um, which uh, are further questions that would need to be answered to to actually have provided for the consequentialist theory to have provided a theory of value, or to have provided a principle that actually specifies what it is that someone should do. Um, Even with that common measure, that even having that common measure of value, even if you could measure it, and even if it really were the one thing that allows you to balance, to weigh one choice against another choice, you would still have the question of, okay, but how should it be distributed? How should it be? Uh, what is the best way in which for it to be distributed?
Right, right. Well, that's. I mean, I guess that's a pretty good summary of the sort of four. I guess four objections against consequentialism here. Um, is there any other place that we wanted to go to, John? Actually, I was kind of curious, John. I mean, what do you think about like threshold deontology? Since sometimes that gets mentioned to me. Basically, I mean, you're familiar with this, right? Or
Yeah, that it's only once the consequences pass a certain threshold that you should then violate someone's rights in order to produce an action with the best consequences. That kind of view.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I, I mean, it basically it's just as a form of utilitarian, as a form of consequentialism, it just falls afoul, I think, of all these further problems. It's just that, well, and indeed, I think there are many more problems with consequentialism than the ones that we've talked about. These are just kind of a nice set of three groups of a nice yeah a nice set of three different kinds of objections that can be presented to consequentialism. But um, I think any theory which treats producing the best consequences as the measure of the goodness of an action, even if it's only a measure of the goodness of an action, how right an action is, when those consequences are past a certain threshold, you're still going to run into all of these problems.
um, I guess I'll need you to spell out that one. So, I mean, do you not think that there are Well, maybe, I mean, maybe if you hold on to some sort of particularism, you could probably get away. I'll have to think about how to get away with this, but um, having certain types of normative principles which would be repressed in virtue of something unique. Let's say that we found a different species of animals that were more sentient than us, just had more intelligence, and that there was something higher at stake.
Mm-hmm.
That if the continuation of their life was sustained, it would be more valuable than our own. But we have certain types of principles of where we shouldn't. We should maybe certain types of normative principles that we would actually value human life above all anything else. Do you think that your type of particularism would just sort of, I guess, amend the ideas that this, if this race of some sort, alien species, was eliminated, that would give into sort of problems under your view? Hopefully that was clear enough.
I think I actually missed. Describe the scenario again.
Yeah, so if we just had let's say that we had some sort of like normative principle, like some sort of categorical norm that we all operated on, that we should value basically human beings above most other types of species. But there might have been some other types of species that just seems more intrinsically valuable in that if they weren't to survive, other shit's gonna happen that would be catastrophe, like would lead to catastrophes. Like they just seem to have more values, and we should amend our normative values that we had earlier because it breaks a
Hmm.
certain type of threshold.
Okay. Certainly, yeah, I'm trying to think. And you're just asking for my opinion on this.
Yeah, I mean, unless you don't have one, or unless you're still confused in how I formulated the question, because that's possible.
I think I am a little bit confused. I mean, I guess I reject the premise, I suppose, if you're asking for my assessment of the scenario. I mean, it would, I think it would be strange to accept an account of what has value, indeed here, what creatures have value, which relied on how much of a thing that creature had. So
Right.
how intelligent a creature is, or
Well, it
how
wouldn't be
rational a
it
creature is.
wouldn't be just, I guess, how valuable. Yeah, it wouldn't just be intelligent. Let me formulate it in a different way. But maybe that would just immediately have consequences for us. So if the extinction of, say, another type of civilization or another type of alien race of some sort meant that there's going to be some sort of detriment to how our ecosystem works, for example. I know this is getting into sort of bordering on sci-fi at this point, but we can imagine these because some sci-fi scenarios are kind of interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we're relying upon them to maintain our ecosystem of some sort, and it's either us or them. And not only that, but they're actually, let me formulate it in this a different way. Let's say that there are a multiplicity of alien species, such that the survival of one, um, or sorry, the extinction of one would mean the extinction of several types of races. Maybe not us, but the extinction of many types of races. Um, do we value ourselves over these other types of races? I guess my question, or do we see the sort of need or the value of this other type of race in order to maintain maybe the lives of many other types of alien species in the millions? Does that make sense?
I think I have a better picture of, yeah, the scenario you're describing. Um, One thing that I will say is, and this is something which some normative ethical theories allow for and some don't, but I think we will often find that there just is no right action, that all of the choices that are available to us are wrong. And of course, we still have to do something, and there's so still going to be something that we and some options are going to be better than others. But in a scenario like you're describing, where we're trading off the extinction of one species for the extinction of another species, the extinction of one race of people for extinction of another race of people, and so on, you are going to, I think it would be warranted to regret any of the decisions that are taken, and to treat any of the decisions that are taken as ultimately bad decisions, even if they're the best of a bad lot. What the specific decision that should be taken in that scenario is I have no idea. I think it would depend on more particular features of the situation
Sure.
itself.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Um, if that's the case, we can move on from the sci-fi examples and move on to something more substantive. It's fine. Um, I mean, is there?
I'm,
Yeah.
I'll maybe add actually something which uh, is an upshot. I think, and maybe it's a good upshot, but it might say a bad upshot of a particularist view as opposed to a consequentialist or deontological view, and that is that in under particularism, these kinds of uh, hypothetical questions, these kinds of questions where we ask, like, okay, I've described a scenario, what should I do in this scenario? They come out as misleading or meaningful questions to be asking in normative ethics and in applied ethics. And they come out as, at best, able to help us to identify the morally salient or the morally relevant features of a situation, and they can be useful for that. So Thompson's violin thought experiment is very useful for that. It identifies um, a certain relationship between the dependence of a life on a person and the right to have your life sustained when your life depends on another person, as in the cases of her violinist or in the case of a fetus. And so those kinds of thought experiments can be useful to identify these relationships between morally salient features. But as far as when these kinds of questions are asked as one of what's the right choice in this situation, um, a, a, given if particularism is true, what it implies is that uh, no amount of specifying these features is going to ultimately be enough to give a verdict, or it's never going to be sufficient for a verdict. That there could always then be some further thing you add to the situation, which would make some cases of the choice wrong and other cases of the choice right. So there's always going to be uh, this further the sensitivity to further features of the situation which haven't been specified, because any hypothetical is always somewhat underspecified, with uh, in order to
Sure. Yeah.
the verdict will depend on those further features.
There's just not enough. Um, there's just not enough information in order to make an epistemological judgment. I hear what you're saying. There also
Exactly.
seems to be, I mean, there seems to always be this sort of lingering problem, but I mean, obviously more substantive in the sense that you're saying, but there seems to always be this lingering problem that one can say an action isn't rational enough because they haven't concluded enough, they haven't gotten enough evidence to make a solid judgment. Because there could always be auxiliary forms of evidence that might um, restipulate what we would do in this scenario ethically or even epistemologically, say if we're studying
Uh-huh.
science. That I think that always seems to be a sort of lingering problem in epistemology is that where do we exactly draw the line for a thing being justified or non-justified in virtue of us being able to accumulate more evidence in favor or as a merit towards this type of belief, as a form of dismerit for this type of belief.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that I think points to the sensitivity of even epistemic questions to practical questions, because we don't really have these kinds of worries of what amount of evidence is enough evidence when there is a certain urgency in the use of either the evidence or of the theory that may or may not be supported by the evidence. That we, at the end of the day, have to make choices, and the sort of fact that we must eventually act, and indeed sometimes must act urgently, will not only force us into acting on whatever evidence we currently have, and so force us to not require of ourselves that we accumulate more evidence, um, but will indeed, or at least as I think these kinds of examples are suggestive of, these kinds of scenarios that you're talking about are suggestive of, will indeed show that it's rational to not seek further evidence in certain cases because you simply have to make a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And once we exit that context of choice, once we take a step back and say, okay, but like, is it just rational to accept this scientific theory, period, without any relation to how that scientific theory will be used in action? Then I think we do, yeah, we are kind of just at a loss, since you would think, well, you can always just gather more evidence, and it would be always irrational to not have
Right.
more and more evidence
Right.
before deciding whether or not to believe it. But
Yeah.
that's just because deciding whether or not to believe a theory isn't really a decision if there's no relation to using the theory.
Yeah. I bring that up because it just reminded me of something I actually read from John Elster since you mentioned sour grapes. Because he mentioned that very idea of, one could always kind of call another person irrational on the basis of not getting sufficient amounts of evidence or forms of auxiliary forms of evidence in order to stipulate what I mean. Sorry, in order to justify um, their judgments or their beliefs, like having justified beliefs, and this puts us in a form of like perpetual skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure how I would go about resolving some of that. It just seems like just some evidence seems to be good enough. Um, but of course, it ends up being the case later down the road that that wasn't enough. And because we have cases down the road that disprove our original judgments, we should remain in some sort of perceptual skepticism about all of our epistemic and moral judgments. I mean, do you think you have a reply to something like that, or do you think that there might not be a solution to something like that?
I think a satisfying answer is going to be, it would take a long time to get to, but certainly I find it in these kinds of conversations, it helps to always remember that justification is not the same thing as truth, and justification is not the same thing as guaranteeing truth, and
That's
that off.
that's
Yeah.
true. That's true, but I'm wondering if the person that's later on saying like, okay, we weren't actually justified in the original um in the original statement is actually just saying like, okay, it was just not justified because of the lack of information at that point as well. It's not that we're trying to obtain an act like truth as it really is, and there's no further evidence to conclude, and we've reached the evidence as it is. Absolutely, it's that it's just that in virtue of there being these sorts of cases of where later on we find out that even a small amount of information was needed,
Mm-hmm.
that we weren't justified. And I think that type of criticism is valid in a lot of the time, that we should have waited, right? I mean, I don't know if you read that paper. I'm trying to remember who was it by. I think it was Hannah Arendt. And I think we were
Mm.
talking about this earlier about the bombing that occurred in World War II with Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
And she was basically making the case that the bombs could have been dropped in any a number of places that weren't within cities, and that would have been a demonstration of power that would have been sufficient to maybe end the war, but we'll have never known, because instead we chose not to do that. Instead, we chose not to wait for a sufficient period of time. We didn't contemplate auxiliary forms um, of good actions that we could have done in that scenario. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, and I think even if we recognize that justification doesn't need to guarantee truth, indeed, justification, there still is a question of justification, and how much evidence and how much thought do we have to put into a decision, or into, in this case, a decision, in Hiroshima case, a decision, but in scientific cases of just the selection of a theory, acceptance or rejection of a theory. How much thought and evidence do we have to put into that choice to be justified in the choice that we ultimately make, even if it ends up being the wrong choice or a false. If it's we're talking about a belief, even if the belief we end up picking is false, right? Or if it's an action, and even if the action we end up taking is wrong. And that's certainly, yeah. I mean, that just is a question which has to be answered in order to. I would just say it has to be answered. Has to be answered. Period. But, and this isn't an answer, but I think this is a direction that is fruitful when it comes to answering this question, and points to something. Points to how I think it makes more sense to answer this kind of question, and that's to say that the question of whether our choice was justified is really a question about whether or not we acted responsibly, whether or not we responsibly assess the evidence. We were responsible in the collection of evidence. We were responsible in the deliberation on that evidence. We were responsible in acting on that evidence, or making the choice to be made on the basis of that evidence, as opposed to being irresponsible. And it's once the request for justification goes beyond that and becomes one of, could we have better guaranteed the truth of the belief we picked if we gathered more evidence? Then we've gone into this space in which really there's no clear stopping point where you could just keep, as you've been saying, you could just keep saying, well, more evidence, which we should have been looking for more evidence. More evidence should have been required, and we weren't justified because we could have got more evidence. But if we shift to this topic of responsibility, when am I being responsible in the assessment and collection of evidence, then I think that's where we will find a more satisfying stopping point than if we look for some other kind of basis for justification.
And the funny thing is, I guess the interesting thing is that the stopping point is also going to be determined by the particular scenarios. There's other particular scenarios, and since your theory can amend, for this caveat, I guess, or this wrench, is just it's going to be it's going to be context sensitive, right? So, some scenarios of when we stop looking for things, say, okay, when do I stop looking for a piece of paper to write on, or something, I don't know, something minor is obviously going to be different from, okay, well, do we drop an atomic bomb on a nation exactly in this place? Or it seems, I'll bet a lot is at stake right there.
Exactly, yeah. The stakes of the choice are going to heavily determine how much gathering of evidence, how much careful deliberation we should put into a decision.
Yeah, and here you're going to basically rely on a certain type of virtue like temperance and well, I don't know. I don't know what type of cardinal virtues you would all invoke for this type of situation. It's kind of hard to analyze off the top of your mind, but probably obviously a lot of different types of virtues there, but temperance first comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, okay. Do we have anything else that you think you want to talk about, John, or you want to wrap it up here pretty soon? We have been talking for almost 2 hours.
Yeah, I think I do have to get going sometime around 5 or 4, I guess 4 your time. So now this is looking like a good time to wrap up.
Okay. So let's wrap it up. Do we have, just briefly, do we have any more questions from the audience that we wanted to assess with John about normative ethics, meta ethics, moral particularism? Any pressing issues before we get going here? Because we got at least 7 more minutes or 8 more minutes. We might not though. At this point, I wish I had some like game music, like
oh yeah, some background music would be nice.
Yeah, some what's it called? Who Wants to Be a Millionaire music.
Oh, dun, 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 dun.
Well, that, but I was thinking of this. mean, extremely, extremely suspenseful music in terms of the questions.
Oh yeah, with
Yeah,
the heartbeat in the background.
yeah, yeah. After the $500,000 question on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Indeed. Oh, we did get
Anyways,
some questions actually just now.
what's that?
We did get some questions just now, which maybe
Oh,
we
did
can
you?
talk
Oh, yeah.
about.
We did not. We did not cover divine command theory. I mean, I don't personally have any objections against divine command theory, other than it seems as though they'd have to prove a god exists, which seems very, very difficult in my opinion, and I think it's probably pretty difficult in your opinion as well, since you hold on to some sort of Kantian objections to the cosmological and the ontological argument.
Yeah, I'm quite what's the word, accepting of, because Kant of course has practical arguments in favor of belief in God, and I think those are rather compelling. Although that said, and I'd be actually interested, if you want, we can. I'd be down to add to their topic for next time. Or like, when I say next time, I mean next time I'm on, whenever that is.
Mm-hmm.
I would be interested in talking about Euthyphro arguments against divine command theory, because I do think that
Ah, yeah,
even if
okay,
even if God exists, and even if we're
yeah,
justified in believing in God,
yeah.
appeal to a divine command theory does run afoul of something like the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yeah, I know William Lane Craig's objection is that it's not true just because God wills it, but because it's in God's nature, and so it becomes a sort of ontological grounding within his nature to show that divine command theory is true. Um,
Perhaps we can go over some of these, yeah, objections and counter objections to the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yeah, and I guess the question of whether it's taken seriously anymore, I mean, I do know that there's a number of philosophers within the analytic tradition who do take it seriously. I think William Lane Craig takes it seriously. I think he is a
Yeah,
divine command theorist.
Linda Zagzebski is another good example. She's a very good epistemologist and ethicist who takes divine command theory, or she calls it divine motivation theory,
Right.
very seriously.
Okay. All
And
right.
so I'd be interested in that.
Oh, what's that?
Oh, so yeah, I'd be interested in talking about that next time.
All right, guys. Well, we're gonna wrap it up here with John. Thanks for coming on, John, once again.
No problem.
It's always a pleasure hearing you. I mean, you're definitely one of the most knowledgeable people about philosophy. Just in case the audience doesn't realize this, I asked John for a lot of advice. I mean, it's constant. I feel sort of bad, but he's an abundant source. It's like a spring. What's the God, sparagmos of information, to use some Greek.
You're too kind.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us, John. Hopefully
No
we'll have
problem.
you on next time. Maybe with some multiple people. I've been thinking about doing a few multiple people, having a multiplicity of people to have a kind of conversation going. But I feel you might be doing some solo takedowns on us if we allow that.
We'll see. We'll see. I'd be down. Yeah, we'll talk about that another time.
Sure. Well, you have a good one for now, John. Thanks for joining us,
Thanks
and
for having me.
thank you guys for coming on. Until next time, thank you. You guys have a good one. I'll see you on Thursday.